You always think you'll see it coming, that there'll be some telltale sign, some moment when the cracks become visible, and you can brace yourself before everything falls apart. But that's not how it happened for me. For months, no years, I was blind. Or maybe I just didn't want to see. It started with a single slip. A text notification that popped up on her phone while she was in the shower. I wasn't snooping, God. I wasn't even looking for anything. But there it was, plain as day. A message from one of her friends. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. For a moment I didn't move. I just stared at the screen, my brain fumbling to process what I was seeing. My first instinct wasn't even anger, it was disbelief. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a joke. Some inside thing I didn't understand. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But then I started piecing things together. The late nights when she said she was out with friends. The way she always kept her phone face down on the table. The way this guy, Mike, acted around me, all smirks and thinly veiled disdain. I put the phone back down, exactly where she'd left it, and walked out of the room. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was spinning, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Mike. He was one of those guys who always seemed just a little too friendly with her. At parties, he'd find excuses to pull her aside for private conversations. He'd laugh a little too hard at her jokes, stand a little too close when they talked, and she never pushed him away. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but a part of me hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I was making something out of nothing? The next morning, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I asked her about Mike casually, trying to gauge her reaction. She didn't even blink. Oh, Mike? He's just a friend. Why? The lie was so smooth, so effortless, that I almost believed her. Almost. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more things. A pattern began to emerge, one I couldn't ignore. The way her friendships with certain guys always seemed to take on an edge of flirtation. The way she'd act cagey about her plans, brushing off my questions with vague answers. I started paying closer attention, and what I found made my stomach turn. Mike wasn't the only one. There were others. Guys I'd met, shaken hands with, bought drinks for. Guys who'd sat in my living room, smiled in my face, and pretended to be my friend while they were screwing my girlfriend behind my back. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the humiliation. The thought that they all knew. That they were laughing at me behind my back, watching me play the fool. I replayed every interaction in my head, every moment when they'd been just a little too smug, a little too cold. It all made sense now. She must have thought she was so clever, so untouchable. But she'd underestimated me. One night, when she was out with her friends, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed proof, something concrete I could confront her with. So I went through her phone. I hated myself for it, but I needed to know. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were texts, photos, even videos. Each one was like a dagger to the chest, a reminder of how blind I'd been. They talked about me in their messages, mocking me, calling me names. She'd lied to my face over and over, and I'd believed her every time. I sat there for hours, reading every word, until my anger reached a boiling point. When she came home that night, I was waiting for her. Had a good time? I asked, my voice calm but tight. She hesitated, sensing the tension. Yeah. Why? I held up her phone, her texts with Mike open on the screen. Her face went pale. Care to explain this? For the first time in our relationship, she was speechless. And for the first time, I realized just how little I really knew her. The moments stretched between us, suffocating and still. Her eyes darted to the phone in my hand, then back to me. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the frantic scramble for an excuse, a deflection. Anything to dig herself out of the hole she'd fallen into. You went through my phone? She said finally, her voice shaking with anger and something else. Guilt, maybe. I laughed, a bitter sound that tasted like bile in my throat. That's what you're upset about? Not the fact that you've been screwing Mike, and who knows how many others, behind my back. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But she didn't. Instead, She folded her arms across her chest and said, "I can explain. Go ahead," I said, leaning back against the wall, my arms crossed. "I'd love to hear this." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she let out a shaky breath. "It didn't mean anything," she said. It was a mistake. A few mistakes." My blood boiled. "Mistakes," I said, my voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday or leaving the stove on. This," I gestured to the phone in my hand, the texts and photos that burned into my brain, "isn't a mistake. It's a pattern. It's a goddamn lifestyle." She flinched, but I didn't care. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her tone defensive now. "It's not like I don't care about you. I do. I love you." I barked out a laugh, shaking my head. "Love me? That's rich. You've been sleeping with guys I've had beers with, guys I've let into my home, and you want to stand there and tell me you love me? It's not like that," she said, her voice rising to match mine. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did," I said, my voice cutting through hers like a blade. "Over and over again. And you didn't stop. You didn't even try to stop." Her face crumpled, and for a split second, I thought she might start crying. But then her expression hardened. "Fine," she snapped. "I screwed up. Is that what you want to hear? Yes, I made mistakes, but I'm only human. You're not perfect either, you know?" The audacity of her words knocked the breath out of me. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" She threw her hands in the air. "You're always working. You're always stressed. Half the time, it feels like you don't even see me. And when you do, it's like you're just going through the motions. Do you even know the last time you told me you loved me?" Her words hit like a slap to the face, but not because they were true. Because they were the kind of excuse people made when they didn't want to take responsibility for their actions. "So, it's my fault?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I'm not saying that," she said, but her eyes told a different story. "You know what?" I said, shaking my head. "I don't care anymore. Whatever excuse you want to use to justify what you've done, fine. But don't you dare try to put this on me." I walked past her to the couch, where I'd set the folder I'd prepared earlier that night. It was full of printed screenshots, every piece of evidence I'd found in her phone. I handed it to her without a word and watched as she flipped through it, her face growing paler with each page. "Look at it," I said coldly. "Every text, every photo, every goddamn lie." Her hands trembled as she closed the folder and set it on the table. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't fix this," I said. "Sorry doesn't undo what you've done." She looked up at me, her eyes red and glassy. "What do you want me to do?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. For a moment I didn't answer. I didn't know what I wanted. Did I want her to beg? To disappear? To somehow undo the months, maybe years, of betrayal? Finally, I said, "I want you to leave." Her breath hitched. "What?" "You heard me," I said. "Pack your things and get out." "But—" "No buts," I said sharply. "You can stay with one of your friends. I'm sure they'll be happy to have you." Her face crumpled, and this time the tears came. She begged, pleaded, but I was done. I'd spent too long being the fool, the man who trusted her while she walked all over me. When she finally realized I wasn't going to budge, she disappeared into the bedroom to pack. I sat on the couch, staring at the folder she'd left behind. Part of me wanted to burn it, to destroy every trace of what had happened. But another part of me knew I couldn't. This wasn't over yet. When she came back out, her suitcase in hand, she stopped in front of me. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she said softly. I didn't respond. Couldn't. As the door closed behind her, I let out a long breath and leaned back on the couch. The house was quiet now, too quiet. But in that silence, a new resolve began to take shape. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house was silent. A strange, suffocating silence that clung to everything. The echo of the door slamming shut behind her was still ringing in my ears. She was gone. For now, at least, But the emptiness didn't bring peace. It brought questions. Questions that burrowed into my mind like worms. How long had this been going on? How many lies had I swallowed without realizing it? How many nights had I been sitting here, blind and oblivious, while she was out with one of them? I couldn't stop myself. I picked up the folder from the coffee table and flipped through it again, my stomach twisting as I read the messages for what felt like the 100th time. Every word was a slap in the face, a reminder of just how deep the betrayal ran. It wasn't just Mike. That was the part that made my head spin. There was Tom, who'd been at our last barbecue. Jack, who I'd bought drinks for at the bar when we all went out after her promotion. And then there was Brandon, the friend who'd helped her fix her car last winter. The pieces fell into place like shards of broken glass, each one sharp and cutting. The cold stares, the smug smiles, the barely hidden disdain. I'd been too trusting, too naive, too stupid to see what was right in front of me. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her abandoned coffee mug. I hadn't slept. My eyes burned. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was alive, racing with plans and questions. I decided to start digging. Not out of curiosity, this was about preparation. If she thought she could walk out of my life without consequences, she was wrong. Her laptop was still on the desk in the office. She'd never been particularly careful with passwords, and it didn't take long to guess hers. The moment I logged in, it was like stepping into a parallel world, one where the truth was ugly and undeniable. Her email inbox was a graveyard of secrets. Messages from Mike, Tom, Jack, and Brandon were sprinkled throughout, each one more damning than the last. Some were casual jokes and flirty banter, but others were explicit, leaving no doubt about what had happened. But it wasn't just the messages. There were receipts for hotel rooms, tickets to concerts she'd never mentioned, and even a reservation for a restaurant I'd been wanting to try with her for months. She hadn't taken me, of course. She'd gone with one of them. I saved everything. Screenshots, PDFs, anything that could be used later. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I'd need it. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was drowning in evidence. My phone buzzed on the table, her name lighting up the screen. I ignored it. A few seconds later, a text appeared. "Please talk to me. We can fix this." I stared at the words, anger simmering beneath my skin. Fix this? There was nothing left to fix. I put my phone on silent and returned to my search. Her social media accounts were another treasure trove of clues. Her Instagram, carefully curated to show the world how perfect her life was, held hints if you knew where to look. A photo of her and Tom at a work event that I hadn't been invited to. A selfie with Brandon that she'd posted months ago with the caption, "Car troubles? But at least I have great friends." Every post felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That evening, I sat at the table again, surrounded by printouts and notes. The anger that had been boiling in me for days was giving way to something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming control. She thought she could walk all over me, take advantage of my trust, and leave without consequences. But she'd underestimated me. I wasn't just going to walk away. The next day, I called a lawyer. The man I spoke to, Jeremy, listened patiently as I laid everything out. The cheating, the evidence, the lies. By the time I finished, his voice was calm and steady. "You've got a strong case," he said. "If this goes to court, the evidence you've collected will work in your favor. We can argue infidelity as grounds for ending the relationship. Depending on how you want to proceed, we can make this as clean or as brutal as you want." I didn't hesitate. "Make it brutal," I said. Jeremy chuckled softly. "Fair enough. I'll start drafting the paperwork. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. The more we have, the better." That night, I stared at the ceiling in the spare bedroom, my thoughts a storm of anger and determination. I wasn't just going to end things. I was going to end them on my terms. I pictured the smug faces of her friends, the ones who had laughed at me behind my back while pretending to be my buddies. I pictured the way she had looked at me the night I confronted her, the guilt and panic in her eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. There wasn't time for self-pity anymore. Every moment of anger or sadness had to be channeled into something productive. Something that would put me back in control of a situation that had left me humiliated and blindsided. She kept trying to reach me, her texts coming in waves of desperation, anger, and regret. Some messages were pleading, "I'll do anything to fix this. Please just talk to me." Others were defensive. "I'm not the only one at fault here. You ignored me for years." And then there were the angry ones. "You went through my phone? That's just as bad as what I did." I didn't reply to any of them. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a fresh pang of anger. She didn't get to rewrite the narrative. Not this time. Instead, I focused on building my case. My lawyer had been clear, documentation was key. I combed through every text thread, every email, every piece of damning evidence I could find. I backed everything up to an external drive and printed multiple copies of the most incriminating pieces. But this wasn't just about preparing for the divorce. No, that would have been too easy. I wasn't content to quietly end things and let her walk away unscathed. She'd built a web of lies and deceit, one that had tangled me up for far too long. Now I was going to unravel it thread by thread. The first step was confrontation, direct, brutal, and unforgettable. Not with her. With them. Mike was first on my list. He was the ringleader, the one she'd been closest to. I wanted to make an example out of him. I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to squirm under the pressure of knowing I wasn't the clueless fool he'd taken me for. I waited until Friday night, when I knew he'd be at his favorite bar. It was a place I'd been to more times than I could count, often with him and Jane in tow. The thought made my skin crawl, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for hesitation. When I walked in, the bar was crowded but not chaotic. It didn't take long to spot him. He was leaning against the bar, laughing with a group of people, his arms slung around some woman who looked far too young to know better. I walked straight up to him, my heart pounding but my steps steady. "Mike," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to cut through the noise. He turned, and the moment he saw me, his expression faltered. It was subtle, a flicker of recognition, followed by the faintest hint of guilt. But he recovered quickly, flashing that smug grin I'd grown to hate. "Hey man," he said, holding out a hand like nothing was wrong. I didn't take it. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. His smile faded, and he glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. Sure. What's this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," I said. He stiffened, his grin disappearing entirely now. "Look, if this is about..." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice low and sharp. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. You've been screwing my girlfriend. In my home. Behind my back." The group around him fell silent, their eyes darting between us. I could see the woman he'd been leaning on shrinking back, her face a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mike said, his voice defensive. I reached into my pocket and pulled out one of the printed screenshots, holding it up for him to see. It was a photo she'd sent him, taken in our bedroom, the sheets unmistakably ours. "Still want to play dumb?" I asked, my voice icy. His face went pale. "Where the hell did you get that?" "That's none of your concern," I said. "What is your concern is the fact that you're a lying, manipulative piece of shit who thought he could get away with it. Guess what? You didn't." The bar was dead silent now, all eyes on us. Mike shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the door like he was considering bolting. "You don't get to walk away from this," I said, stepping closer. "You're going to pay for what you've done. Every single bit of it." "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "I just wanted you to know that your little secret isn't a secret anymore. And it's not going to stay a secret for much longer." I didn't give him a chance to respond. I turned and walked out of the bar, my heart hammering in my chest. That night, I started drafting emails to the others, Tom, Jack, and Brandon. They'd get their turn soon enough. But Mike was just the beginning. This wasn't just about confronting them. It was about making sure they understood the consequences of their actions. They'd stolen my trust, my dignity, my peace of mind. Now I was going to take it all back. Mike didn't reply to the confrontation. He didn't text, didn't call, and I didn't see him around town after that night at the bar. Good. That was the point. I didn't need words or apologies from him. What I needed was to make sure he, and the others, felt the weight of their actions. It didn't take long for the first crack to show. A few days after the confrontation, I received a message from one of Mike's mutual acquaintances, a woman who frequented the same gym we all used. She'd heard through the grapevine that Mike had been dealing with some personal issues and was thinking about quitting the gym altogether. That wasn't enough for me. I spent hours compiling a detailed message, using the screenshots and photos I'd saved to expose Mike for the fraud he was. The gym was a family-owned business with a sterling reputation, and I doubted they'd take kindly to the idea of their star trainer using his position to mess around with someone else's girlfriend. I sent the email anonymously, attaching everything they'd need to come to their own conclusions. A few days later, the fallout began. Mike's name disappeared from the gym's website, his class schedules erased like he'd never existed. Word spread quickly through the local fitness community, with whispers of inappropriate behavior and a breach of professional ethics, trailing him wherever he went. It was a small victory, but it was enough to set the tone. He'd lost his job, his reputation, and, I suspected, whatever fragile confidence had convinced him he could waltz into someone else's relationship without consequences. Tom was next. Tom was the one who'd always gone out of his way to make me feel like an outsider. He'd been in my living room, eating my food and drinking my beer, smirking at me like he knew something I didn't. And, of course, he had. He worked as a mid-level manager at a local tech company, and while he wasn't particularly prominent in his field, his company took its policies very seriously. I crafted another email, anonymous, precise, and damning. This one included screenshots of texts where he'd mocked me openly while coordinating meetups with her. The company didn't fire him outright, but the rumors that circulated through his office were enough to damage his standing. A friend of mine who worked there mentioned that Tom had been excluded from several key projects and was being quietly pushed to the sidelines. It wasn't just about their jobs. That would have been too easy. I wanted them to feel isolated, unwelcome, and exposed. Brandon, the one who'd been fixing her car, wasn't hard to deal with. He was engaged, his fiancée blissfully unaware of the dirt he'd been rolling in. It took a single email to her, along with a few choice screenshots, to blow his life apart. She called off the engagement within 48 hours. Jack, on the other hand, was trickier. He was slippery, careful, the type who probably thought he was invincible. But even the most careful people leave trails. He'd left just enough breadcrumbs for me to piece together his side hustle, selling personal training programs that were little more than scams. One well-placed post in a local forum revealed him for the con artist he was, and his already shaky reputation collapsed like a house of cards. The real work, though, was happening behind the scenes. I wasn't content with simply exposing their lies. I wanted to make sure that every social circle they operated in knew exactly what kind of people they were. The fitness group chats, the mutual friends, the local hangout spots, they all got anonymous tips. I made sure to frame the information just right. It wasn't about me. It was about the kind of men they were and the kind of choices they'd made. People love a scandal, especially one that's been carefully curated for maximum impact. And then there was her. She wasn't reaching out as much anymore, her once daily texts dwindling to occasional, "I'm sorry" messages that I deleted without reading. I imagined she was starting to feel the effects of everything I'd put into motion. The whispers behind her back, the judgmental looks from people who knew the truth. Good. I wasn't done yet, but I was getting closer. The first domino had fallen, and the chain reaction was well underway. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The wheels of my plan were turning faster now, each piece falling into place with almost poetic precision. The satisfaction I felt watching Mike, Tom, Jack, and Brandon's lives unravel was undeniable, but it wasn't enough. The damage they'd done to me went beyond betrayal. It was humiliation. It was the years I'd spent trusting people who had been laughing at me behind my back. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the power they had stolen from me, piece by piece. Social exposure was the next stage of the plan. It wasn't enough for their professional lives to take a hit. I needed them to feel the sting in their personal circles as well. People like Mike and Tom thrived on reputation, on being seen as the charismatic, trustworthy guys everyone wanted to be around. That was what I was going to strip away from them. Started with Mike. His Instagram, once a carefully curated feed of gym selfies and motivational posts, had gone silent since he lost his job. But it didn't stay quiet for long. Using a burner account, I began leaving comments on his older posts. Is this the guy who sleeps with his clients' girlfriends? Guess the gym didn't think his extra services were worth keeping him around. I wasn't alone. The whispers had started to spread, and soon others joined in. His once adoring followers were asking questions, doubting his carefully crafted persona. Tom's exposure was a little more direct. I created a detailed email, outlining his role in Jane's betrayal, and sent it to a mutual friend who had always seemed a little too interested in gossip. Within days, the story was everywhere, circulating in group chats, whispered at happy hours. His smug smile and condescension vanished as he found himself the target of sideways glances and awkward silences. Brandon's life continued to crumble after his fiancée left him. I'd half expected him to try reaching out to me, to explain himself or apologize, but he didn't. Coward. Instead, he slunk away from the spotlight, unfollowing mutual friends on social media and retreating into obscurity. Jack, though, was defiant. He started posting vague, self-pitying messages online about being misunderstood and targeted by jealous people. I couldn't help but laugh at his desperation. The scam I'd exposed had done more than ruin his side hustle. It had marked him as untrustworthy, and in a community as tightly knit as ours, that was a death sentence. And then there was Jane. I'd been careful with her exposure. While it was tempting to broadcast her infidelity to everyone we knew, I didn't want to come across as vindictive or petty. This wasn't about looking like the victim, it was about making sure she couldn't rewrite the narrative in her favor. Her family was the first to know. I'd sent her sister Lisa a copy of the evidence weeks ago, and though she hadn't said much to me directly, I knew she'd confronted Jane. The few mutual friends we shared had started to pull away from her, their once supportive comments replaced by silence. But Jane was resilient in her own way. She tried to salvage what she could, reaching out to friends with carefully worded explanations and half-truths. Things between us just weren't working. We'd grown apart. He wasn't meeting my needs. She was trying to frame herself as the victim, the wronged party. Couldn't let that stand. The local blog post was my masterstroke. I'd been working on it for weeks, carefully crafting an anonymous exposé that told the entire story without naming names. I included just enough detail for people in our community to connect the dots: Mike's gym, the house parties, the friend group. The post went live on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning it was the talk of the town. People were sharing it on Facebook, discussing it in group chats, speculating about who was involved. Jane's carefully curated image began to crack under the pressure. She called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with anger and panic. "Did you write that post?" she demanded. "What post?" I asked innocently. "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone's talking about it. My mom called me crying this morning. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I shot back, my voice cold. "You destroyed our relationship, lied to my face, and made me the punchline of your private jokes. Don't call me expecting sympathy, Jane." She started to say something else, but I hung up. I didn't need to hear it. That night, I sat in the quiet of the house, staring at the folder of evidence on the table. The storm I'd unleashed was still growing, and I knew it would take time for the dust to settle. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control again. This wasn't over. Not yet. The fallout wasn't immediate, but like a crack spreading through glass. It grew wider and more destructive with every passing day. By the time the weekend arrived, the whispers had turned into open conversations, and everyone who mattered seemed to know the truth, or at least enough of it to piece the rest together. Jane, for all her attempts to maintain her image, was starting to unravel. I didn't need to reach out to see the consequences. The signs were everywhere. A mutual friend texted me, half apologetic, half curious. "Is it true about Jane? I don't want to pry, but people are saying things." I didn't bother responding. I didn't have to. The answers were already out there, circulating like wildfire. I wasn't done, though. If I'd learned anything from this mess, it was that people like Jane and her friends thrived on secrecy, on the belief that they could hide their actions without consequence. Exposing them wasn't just about revenge. It was about accountability. Tom was the first to feel the heat. He'd been relegated to a smaller role at work after my email, but that wasn't enough for me. I knew his company had quarterly team-building retreats, and I also knew several of his colleagues were active on social media. It wasn't hard to find photos from their last outing, with Tom grinning in the background. Using another burner account, I commented on one of the posts. "Funny seeing Tom here after everything that came out. Guess loyalty isn't a requirement for his team." The response was immediate. Comments rolled in, some agreeing, others asking for clarification. By the time the post was taken down, the damage had been done. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Tom had been called into HR for a reputation management discussion. It was only a matter of time before the whispers became impossible to ignore. Brandon, meanwhile, was struggling to recover from his broken engagement. His ex-fiancée had wasted no time spreading the word about why she'd left him, and his attempts to paint himself as a victim fell flat. He stopped showing up to group events altogether, his absence a glaring reminder of his fall from grace. And Mike was a ghost. His gym connections had evaporated, his name blacklisted from every fitness center in the area. Someone sent me a screenshot of a job posting he'd put up on a freelance trainer website, advertising private sessions for half the price he used to charge. The comments were brutal, with users questioning his credibility and professionalism. Then there was Jane. She'd been trying to salvage her social life, reaching out to friends with carefully crafted stories about how our relationship had fallen apart due to irreconcilable differences. But the cracks were already showing. Lisa, her sister, called me one evening. She was hesitant at first, clearly torn between loyalty to her family and frustration with Jane's actions. "She's struggling," Lisa admitted. "I know she messed up, but this is a lot." "And what about me?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. Did she think about how much I'd struggle when she was sneaking around behind my back? When she brought those men into our lives? Lisa was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said finally. I don't know how to help her." "She doesn't need help, Lisa," I said. "She needs to deal with the consequences of her choices." The turning point came when Jane's workplace got wind of the drama. It wasn't intentional on my part, but when someone forwarded the blog post to one of her colleagues, the ripple effect was inevitable. Her boss, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being intolerant of workplace scandals, called Jane in for a meeting. I didn't know the details, but I could guess. Jane had always prided herself on being seen as professional and dependable. Now that image was in shambles. When I saw her a week later, she'd come by to pick up the last of her things. She looked exhausted. Her once pristine appearance was unkempt. Her makeup smudged as though she hadn't bothered to touch it up before facing the world. She didn't say much as she packed, and I didn't offer any small talk. But as she stood by the door, suitcase in hand, she finally spoke. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice flat. I stared at her, feeling a flicker of something that might have been pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "I'm getting there," I said. She nodded, as if she'd expected the answer, then walked out without another word. By the end of the month, the dominoes had fallen completely. The men who had betrayed me were shadows of their former selves, their arrogance replaced by the grim reality of their choices. Jane was isolated, her carefully constructed world in ruins. And me? For the first time in years, I felt free. With Jane gone and the wreckage of her deceit behind me, the house felt different. Lighter, quiet in a way that didn't suffocate. For the first time in months, maybe years, I could sit on the couch and not feel the weight of her secrets pressing down on me. But peace was a strange thing. It didn't come rushing in all at once. It crept in slowly, like the tide, filling the spaces that betrayal and anger had hollowed out. I wasn't happy yet, far from it, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. The first thing I did was reclaim the house. It wasn't just about cleaning. It was about exorcising her presence. I stripped the sheets off the bed we'd shared, threw out the wine glasses we used for her dinners with friends, and packed up the knickknacks she'd littered across every room. By the end of the week, the house looked nothing like it had before. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and even replaced the couch in the living room. It wasn't about erasing her completely, it was about taking back what was mine. I found solace in the routine of it, in the simple, tangible act of building something new. Reclaiming the house was the easy part. Reclaiming myself was harder. For years, I'd defined myself by my relationship with Jane. I put her needs first, her dreams above mine. And look where that had gotten me. It was time to figure out who I was without her, without the weight of her lies.
He started small.
Morning runs through the park. Weekend hikes. Books I'd always meant to read but never got around to. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I'd drifted away from during my years with Jane. Some of them had heard about what happened, but none of them pried. They just showed up, invited me to dinners, sent me stupid memes, checked in when I didn't respond right away. It wasn't long before I realized how much I'd missed them, how much I'd let Jane isolate me, intentionally or not. One evening, about a month after Jane left, I got a message from Lisa. "Hey," it read, "just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Better." Slowly. She responded almost immediately. "Good. You deserve better." Her words stuck with me, not because they were new, I'd heard the same thing from others, but because they came from someone who'd seen both sides of the story. Reclaiming myself also meant letting go of the anger. Not forgetting, not forgiving, just letting go. I couldn't let what Jane and those men had done define me forever. I'd spent weeks tearing their lives apart, and while it had been satisfying in the moment, it wasn't something I wanted to carry with me. They weren't worth it. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in quiet moments when the anger would flare up and then fade, leaving only exhaustion behind. One night, as I sat on the back porch with a drink in hand, I finally let myself acknowledge the truth. I'd done what I needed to do. I'd taken back control. But it was time to stop looking back and start looking forward. The first real step forward came unexpectedly. I was at a friend's birthday party, a small gathering of familiar faces and a few new ones. Among the new faces was a woman named Clara. She wasn't like Jane. She was quieter, more grounded, with an easy smile that didn't feel rehearsed. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. She asked about my work, my hobbies, the books I liked to read. She didn't pry into my past, didn't ask about Jane or the mess I just crawled out of. She was just present. By the end of the night, she'd given me her number, scribbled on the back of a napkin. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It wasn't fireworks or grand gestures. It was slow and steady, a friendship that grew into something more over time. Clara wasn't a bandage for the wounds Jane had left. She was something entirely separate, something that reminded me of who I could be outside of the pain. She didn't fix me. She didn't need to. But she showed me that it was okay to move forward, to trust again, to hope for something better. By the time summer rolled around, the storm Jane had brought into my life felt like a distant memory. The men who had betrayed me were gone, their lives in tatters. Jane herself had faded into the background, her attempts to rebuild overshadowed by the choices she'd made. And me? I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. It came as a surprise. A text from Jane, months after she'd walked out of my life. I deleted her number, but there was no mistaking who it was. "Can we talk? Just once? Please." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her live in the silence she'd earned. But another part of me was curious. What could she possibly have left to say? I finally replied, keeping it simple. What do you want? Her response came almost immediately. I just need to explain. Can we meet? Tomorrow, maybe? Against my better judgment, I agreed. Not because I thought I owed her anything, but because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to know why she'd done what she did. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town. I arrived first, choosing a table near the back where we wouldn't be overheard. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked thinner, her face drawn and tired, her usual polished appearance replaced by something raw and unguarded. She hesitated when she saw me, then forced a small, tentative smile. I didn't smile back. She sat down across from me, fiddling nervously with the edge of her sleeve. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, she spoke. Thank you for meeting me. I shrugged. Say what you need to say. She flinched at my tone but nodded. I've been thinking a lot about everything. What I did to you. How I hurt you. I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. She continued, her voice trembling. I was selfish. I was stupid. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Her apology landed like a stone in water, rippling outward but failing to touch me. Why now? I asked. Why not months ago? She looked down at her hands. Because I thought I could fix it, that I could somehow convince myself it wasn't as bad as it was. But I can't keep lying to myself. I ruined everything, and I know it's my fault. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. I don't need your apology, Jane, I said, my voice cold. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't erase what you did or the months I spent feeling like an idiot because I trusted you. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I know. I just needed you to hear it. For a moment, I considered getting up and walking away, but something kept me rooted in my seat. I loved you, I said quietly. I gave you everything and you threw it away. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. And for what? For men who didn't care about you? For cheap thrills that meant nothing? She sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. I don't have an excuse, she whispered. I was broken. I still am. But you didn't deserve what I did to you. No, I didn't, I said firmly. But it's done now. We're done. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. I hope someday you can forgive me. I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. Forgiveness. It sounded nice in theory, but the wounds she'd left were still fresh, still raw. I don't know if I can, I said honestly. But I've moved on. That's all that matters. She nodded again, her shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. Thank you for listening. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood, tossed a few bills on the table for my coffee, and walked out without looking back. That night, I sat on my porch, staring out at the quiet street. Jane's apology lingered in my mind, but it didn't haunt me the way it might have months ago. I said what I needed to say. I closed the door on that chapter of my life. For the first time, I felt truly free. After my meeting with Jane, I realized something that had been eluding me throughout the chaos. I was finally done. Not just with her, but with the entire storm of betrayal and anger that had consumed me for months. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need to check the social fallout or wonder what her life, or the lives of her so-called friends, looked like now. They were all in the rearview mirror, exactly where they belonged. What mattered now was me, my life, my future. The first step was embracing a clean slate. I'd already taken back the house, repainted the walls, and rearranged the furniture, but it still didn't feel like home. Not yet. The memories of her presence, the arguments, and even the laughter we used to share still clung to the corners like dust I couldn't quite reach. I made the decision to sell it. It wasn't easy. I'd poured years of work into making it ours. But that was the problem. It wasn't just mine. The house was a reminder of the life I thought I was building. A life that turned out to be a lie. Selling it wasn't about running away. It was about moving forward. I found a small, modern apartment downtown. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. No shared memories.
No ghosts.
Just a quiet space to start over. With the apartment came a new sense of freedom. Living in the heart of the city put me closer to everything. Parks, coffee shops, live music venues. Things I hadn't realized I'd been missing out on during the years I'd spent tethered to Jane's world. I started saying yes to things I would have declined before. A coworker invited me to a trivia night at a local pub, and instead of making an excuse, I went. Another old friend asked if I wanted to join a running group, and I found myself lacing up my shoes at 6 in the morning to jog with strangers. Felt strange at first, putting myself out there again. But slowly it began to feel good. Work became another outlet. Without the constant distraction of my collapsing relationship, I found myself throwing more energy into my career. I volunteered for projects I'd normally avoid, started taking the lead in meetings, and even pitched a few ideas to upper management. My efforts didn't go unnoticed. A few months after the divorce was finalized, I was offered a promotion, a position that came with more responsibility and, more importantly, a fresh challenge. But it wasn't just about work or hobbies. It was about people. Clara, the woman I'd met at that birthday party, became a bigger part of my life. Slowly, cautiously, but steadily. She wasn't flashy or dramatic like Jane. She didn't sweep into a room and demand attention. Instead, she listened. She laughed at my stupid jokes and told me stories about her own life, her own struggles. We started going out for dinner, then movies, then weekend hikes. She never pried into my past, never asked for details about Jane or the chaos I'd left behind. She just let me be me. One night, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, she asked, "What do you want from the future?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about the future in so long. My life had been consumed by the past, by untangling the lies and rebuilding my sense of self. But now, with the city lights reflecting off the water and her hand resting lightly on mine, the future didn't feel so intimidating. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but for the first time, I'm excited to figure it out." She smiled, her thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "That's a good place to start." Over the next few months, I let go of the last remnants of my old life. I stopped checking Jane's social media. I deleted the folder of evidence I'd once clung to like a lifeline. I even stopped responding to the occasional text from people who wanted to rehash the drama. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about reclaiming my energy, my time, my thoughts. The man I'd been with Jane, unsure, passive, always bending to accommodate her, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, more self-aware, and far less willing to tolerate bullshit. One afternoon, as I unpacked the last of my boxes in the new apartment, I found an old photo album tucked into the bottom of a bin. It was from the early days with Jane, back when things were good, or at least when I thought they were good. I flipped through it, letting the memories wash over me. The vacations, the parties, the little moments that had once meant everything. And then, without hesitation, I closed the album and set it aside. It didn't belong in my new life. By the time fall rolled around, the anger that had burned so hot for so long had finally begun to cool. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Jane, not at Mike, not at anyone. What I felt was clarity. A calm acceptance of what had happened and an understanding that the scars would fade, even if they never fully disappeared. But closure is a strange thing. You think it's a finish line, something you cross and leave behind. In reality, it's a process, one that sneaks up on you in unexpected ways. One day, I ran into Lisa at the grocery store. She was browsing the produce aisle, inspecting a bag of apples when she spotted me. For a moment, she froze, like she wasn't sure if she should say anything. But then she gave me a small, hesitant smile. "Hey," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "How are you?" "I'm good," I said, and to my surprise, I meant it. "What about you?" She hesitated, her smile faltering. "It's been a lot," she admitted. "With Jane and everything." Hearing her name didn't sting the way it used to. It was just a name now, a piece of my past that no longer held power over me. How is she? I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Lisa sighed, setting the apples back on the shelf. Not great. She's been struggling, honestly. She's trying to piece her life back together. But I think she's still in denial about a lot of things. I nodded, unsure what to say. She knows she messed up, Lisa continued, but she doesn't know how to fix it. I don't think she even knows how to fix herself. For a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite identify. Not pity exactly. Maybe sadness for the person Jane could have been, the person I thought she was. I hope she figures it out, I said finally. Lisa looked surprised, but then she nodded. Me too. We chatted for a few more minutes. About her kids, her work, nothing heavy, before parting ways. As I walked back to my car, I realized that I didn't feel the weight of Jane's name anymore. It didn't hurt to hear about her struggles, but it didn't bring me any satisfaction either. It was just neutral, and that, I realized, was its own kind of closure. A few weeks later, Clara and I were having dinner at a quiet little bistro downtown. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with her. She told me about a trip she was planning with friends, and I told her about the promotion I'd finally decided to accept. At one point, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting down my fork. "Do you ever think about her?" "Jane, I mean." The question didn't catch me off guard the way it might have months ago. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way I used to. It's more like remembering an old injury. You know it's there, but it doesn't hurt anymore." She nodded, her eyes searching mine. "That's a good way to put it." I reached across the table and took her hand, my thumb brushing against hers. "I don't think about what I lost anymore. I think about what I've gained. And you're a big part of that." She smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "That's the sweetest thing you've ever said to me." I grinned. "Don't get used to it." That night, as I lay in bed next to Clara, I thought about how far I'd come. The man I was when Jane left, the angry, humiliated shell of myself, was unrecognizable now.
Ide rabuil. Ide grown.
And most importantly, I'd learned to let go. There were lessons in the pain, though I hadn't seen them at the time. Lessons about trust, self-worth, and resilience. Jane had taken so much from me, but she hadn't taken everything. I'd reclaimed what mattered most. Myself. The winter was quieter than I'd expected, but it didn't feel empty. The apartment, with its warm lighting and simple decor, had become a refuge, a space that felt truly mine. Every corner reflected the choices I had made, free from the weight of anyone else's expectations. Life had settled into something steady and calm. The chaos that had defined the last year was gone, replaced by a rhythm I could rely on. Work, friends, Clara. They all fit into my life in a way that felt seamless, natural. One Saturday morning, I found myself standing at the window, a cup of coffee warming my hands as I watched the city waking up below. The streets were quiet, coated with a thin layer of frost that glistened in the early sunlight. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Clara's voice broke the silence. "You're up early," she said, patting into the room in one of my old sweatshirts. I turned to see her rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a mess of curls that made her look impossibly endearing. "Couldn't sleep," I said, smiling. She joined me by the window, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Bad dreams?" "No," I said softly. "Just thinking." She looked up at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "About what?" I hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "About how much has changed. About how much better things are now." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It's nice, isn't it? Being here now."
No baggy, no drama.
"Just us." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is." The rest of the day was spent running errands and making plans for the future. Clara and I talked about a road trip we wanted to take in the spring, a weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt like a step forward, a chance to create new memories, untethered from the past. That evening, as we cooked dinner together, Clara turned to me with a curious expression. Do you ever regret it? How it all ended with her? I paused, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. I used to, I admitted. For a long time, I thought about all the ways I could have done things differently. All the ways she could have done things differently. And now, I set the knife down and met her gaze. Now, I think it ended the way it needed to. It hurt like hell, but it got me here. And here is exactly where I want to be. She smiled, her eyes warm. Good, because I kind of like having you here. I laughed, leaning down to kiss her forehead. I kind of like being here too. Later that night, after Clara had fallen asleep, I found myself sitting on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The air was cold but crisp, refreshing in a way that made me feel alive. For the first time, I let myself reflect on everything that had happened. Not with anger or bitterness, but with acceptance. Jane, Mike, Tom, Jack, Brandon, they were all part of a chapter I'd closed for good. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't feel anything for them. What mattered now was what lay ahead. As I sat there, the faint hum of the city below and the warmth of the apartment behind me, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't thought possible. The scars were still there, but they didn't define me. They were just part of the story, a reminder of what I'd been through and how far I'd come. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and smiled. The past was behind me. The future was mine. The end.